In the ashes of revolution, a young Corsican soldier rose to command the destiny of Europe. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte, a man of unmatched ambition, a strategist whose genius changed the face of warfare, and a ruler whose vision reshaped nations. From the battlefield of Austerlitz crossed swords to the throne of France crowned, and finally to the lonely exile of St. Helena, his life was a story of brilliance, glory, and downfall. Was he a hero who built modern Europe, or a tyrant blinded by power? Today, on History Vault, we uncover the extraordinary journey of the man who dared to crown himself emperor. Stay with us till the end as we reveal the true legacy of Napoleon Bonaparte, a tale that still defines leadership, ambition, and destiny. Backhand index pointing right, CTA inside intro. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon bell so you never miss our deep dive documentaries into the lives that shaped history. On a small island in the Mediterranean, far from the palaces of Paris and the battlefields of Europe, a boy was born who would one day change the destiny of nations. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte. Born on August 15, 1769, in Ajaccio, Corsica, he was not destined for greatness by birth. Corsica had only recently been conquered by France, and the Bonaparte family lived between two identities, Corsican patriots and loyal subjects of France. This duality would shape the mind of the young boy who dreamed beyond the horizons of his island. Napoleon's father, Carlo Bonaparte, was a lawyer and a political figure in Corsica, while his mother, Letizia, was a strict but resilient woman whose discipline left a permanent mark on her son. From her, Napoleon inherited not only strength, but also the ambition to rise above circumstances. The Bonaparte family was not rich, but they carried themselves with dignity, holding on to dreams greater than their means. Napoleon's childhood was one of discipline, hardship, and a hunger to prove himself in a world where status often defined destiny. At the age of 9, Napoleon left Corsica for the mainland of France to pursue military education. This was no small step. Imagine a young boy, unfamiliar with French culture, struggling with the language, surrounded by children from noble families who looked down upon him as an outsider. He was ridiculed for his Corsican accent and his humble origins. But these insults became fuel for his inner fire. Where others saw weakness, Napoleon saw the chance to forge strength. He buried himself in books, mathematics, history, philosophy, and most importantly, the great military campaigns of the past. Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, Hannibal. These were the figures who filled his imagination and whose footsteps he dreamed of following. In military school, Napoleon displayed remarkable intelligence. He was not the most social or popular student, but his sharp mind and mastery of strategy set him apart. Teachers noted his extraordinary memory and analytical ability. He could study a map for minutes and recall every detail, a skill that later made him a master of battlefields. While others played, Napoleon calculated. While others talked of noble heritage, Napoleon thought of the future he would build with his own hands. By the time he became a young officer, France itself was on the verge of chaos. The French Revolution erupted in 1789, shaking the foundations of monarchy, nobility, and tradition. For Napoleon, this was both a danger and an opportunity. The old system that valued birth over talent was crumbling, and in its place rose a new world where merit and ambition could push a man forward. The revolution gave Napoleon the chance to step out of the shadows of obscurity. He first made his mark during the siege of Toulon in 1793. The city had rebelled against the revolution and allied itself with Britain. France desperately needed victory, and it was here that a young artillery officer named Napoleon Bonaparte revealed his genius. With bold strategy and precise artillery placement, he turned the tide of battle, forcing the British to withdraw. For this, he was promoted at the age of just 24 to brigadier general. In a single stroke, Napoleon had transformed himself from a young, unknown Corsican officer into one of the rising stars of revolutionary France. But his story was not only about battles. It was about resilience and timing. In the shifting tides of the revolution, he lost favor more than once, even being arrested under suspicion of disloyalty. Yet every setback became a chance for a greater comeback. His destiny was not to remain in the shadows. In 1796, he was given command of the Army of Italy. What happened next would astonish Europe. The Italian campaign became Napoleon's stage, and the world his audience. Facing poorly equipped and demoralized troops, he inspired them with fiery words. Soldiers, you are hungry and naked. The government owes you much, but can give you nothing. I will lead you into the most fertile plains in the world. Rich provinces, great cities will be in your power. There you will find honor, glory, and riches. These words ignited hearts, and Napoleon delivered. With daring maneuvers, lightning speed, and a brilliant understanding of terrain, he crushed Austrian forces again and again. He marched through Italy like a storm, defeating armies larger than his own, shocking generals who underestimated the young commander. Each victory did more than secure land. It built Napoleon's legend. Soldiers began to see him not just as a general, but as a leader who carried destiny in his hands. By the age of 27, Napoleon was no longer simply a Corsican outsider. He was a hero of France, a man whose name inspired both admiration and fear. His rise was not an accident. It was a result of ambition sharpened by hardship, intellect refined by study, and opportunity seized at the perfect moment. As he returned from Italy, celebrated as a conqueror, France stood at a crossroads. The revolution had given freedom, but also chaos. The government was weak, corruption rampant, and enemies circled at its borders. And into this vacuum of power stepped Napoleon Bonaparte, the soldier of destiny, who had risen from obscurity to challenge kings and emperors. But this was only the beginning. The boy from Corsica had proven himself on the battlefield. Now he would set his sights on an even greater prize, the throne of France itself. The Italian campaign was only the opening act. Napoleon Bonaparte had risen like a storm, but Europe was not yet ready for the scale of brilliance he was about to unleash. His victories in Italy had shocked Austria and impressed France, but to Napoleon, they were simply proof of what was possible when strategy, speed, and vision converged. Now he set his eyes on shaping Europe itself. Unlike most generals of his time, Napoleon refused to fight battles by the rules. Traditional armies moved slowly, relying on rigid formations and cautious maneuvers. But Napoleon believed war was not just about numbers. It was about momentum, surprise, and the will to break your enemy before they even understood what was happening. He turned battlefields into living chessboards, moving his armies with speed and precision that left opponents stunned. In 1798, Napoleon embarked on an ambitious campaign in Egypt, hoping to strike at British trade routes and weaken their empire. Though the campaign was mixed in its outcome, it revealed something deeper about him. His vision stretched beyond immediate battles. He was not just a general. He was a strategist who thought of nations, empires, and global influence. Standing before the pyramids, he told his soldiers, "From the heights of these pyramids, 40 centuries look down upon you." His words transformed soldiers into warriors of history, linking their struggle with the legacy of ancient civilizations. But while Egypt tested his ambition, it was Europe that awaited his return. By 1799, France was again in political crisis, its government fragile and unpopular. Napoleon, with his aura of victory, marched into Paris and seized power in a bloodless coup, establishing himself as first consul. France had found its savior, and Europe had found its greatest challenger. What followed was a series of battles that rewrote the art of war. In 1800, at the Battle of Marengo, Napoleon's forces clashed with the Austrians in northern Italy. At first, his army faltered and defeat seemed certain. But Napoleon refused to surrender. With masterful timing, he unleashed his reserves at the decisive moment, turning impending disaster into a stunning victory. Marengo not only secured France's position in Italy, but also reinforced Napoleon's reputation as a commander who thrived under pressure, one who could snatch triumph from the jaws of defeat. By 1804, Napoleon crowned himself Emperor of the French, a symbol of how far the Corsican outsider had come. But power brought enemies. Austria, Russia, Britain, and later Prussia all united to crush him. It was on the fields of Austerlitz in 1805, known as the Battle of the Three Emperors, that Napoleon's genius reached its peak. Facing the combined might of Austria and Russia, he deliberately appeared weak, luring his enemies into a false sense of advantage. Then, like a master pulling strings on a grand stage, he unleashed his forces with devastating precision. By the end of the day, the Allied armies were shattered and Europe stood in awe. Historians would forever remember Austerlitz as Napoleon's greatest victory, a battle where intellect triumphed over sheer numbers. But Napoleon's wars were not only about victories. They reshaped the very map of Europe. Kingdoms fell, new states were created, and old monarchies trembled. His campaign spread the ideas of the French Revolution, liberty, equality, secular governance, far beyond France's borders. Yet with every conquest came resistance, and the more he expanded, the more enemies rose against him. In 1806, he crushed the Prussians at Jena and Auerstedt, showing once again that speed and surprise were his greatest weapons. Within weeks, an entire kingdom had been humbled. His armies marched into Berlin, and Napoleon seemed invincible. Europe belonged to him, or so it appeared. At the height of his power, Napoleon created the Continental System, an attempt to economically strangle Britain by closing European ports to British trade. But this was not a battlefield victory. It was an economic war, and here Napoleon faces limits. Britain's navy remained untouchable, and its trade networks vast. The blockade strained Europe as much as it weakened Britain. Slowly, cracks began to appear in the empire Napoleon had built. Yet, his military brilliance still shone. In 1809, at Wagram, Napoleon faced Austria again in a colossal battle involving over 300,000 men. The clash was brutal, the losses immense, but once again, Napoleon emerged victorious. He had mastered the art of modern warfare, commanding armies of unprecedented size with organization and vision that few could match. Napoleon's genius was not only in battle tactics, but in logistics. He moved armies faster than anyone thought possible, supplied them through clever organization, and inspired them with his presence. Soldiers followed him not just because he was their commander, but because he was their symbol. He shared their hardships, marched alongside them, and remembered the names of officers and men. To his soldiers, he was more than an emperor. He was an embodiment of glory. But even as victories piled up, shadows grew longer. Wars drained resources, cost countless lives, and stirred resentment. Nations that had once been defeated began to rise again, learning from Napoleon's methods, adapting to his style. The very brilliance that had made him unstoppable also created enemies united by fear. By 1812, Napoleon's empire stretched across much of Europe. He had redrawn borders, placed family members on thrones, and dictated terms to kings and emperors. From Madrid to Moscow, his influence was felt. Yet, in this very expansion lay the seeds of downfall. The wider his reach, the harder it became to hold. And as he prepared for his greatest gamble, the invasion of Russia, the world began to wonder. Had the master of battles finally stretched his genius too far? The soldier who had risen from obscurity now stood as the most powerful man in Europe, but history would soon test him in ways that no battlefield victory could erase. The tide of destiny was turning, and Napoleon was about to march into a storm from which even his brilliance might not save him. By 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte stood at the peak of his power. He ruled an empire that stretched from the Atlantic Ocean to the borders of Russia, from the mountains of Spain to the rivers of Poland. His brothers and allies sat on thrones across Europe. To his followers, he seemed unstoppable, a man chosen by destiny to shape the modern world. But history has a way of humbling even the greatest of men, and Napoleon was about to face the campaign that would define his downfall, the invasion of Russia. The reasons were both political and strategic. Napoleon's continental system, his economic blockade designed to strangle Britain, had begun to fail. Many nations resisted the embargo, and Russia, under Tsar Alexander I, openly defied it. To Napoleon, this was not just rebellion, it was betrayal. In his mind, Russia had to be punished, forced back into obedience, or the entire structure of his empire would collapse. And so, he gathered the greatest army Europe had ever seen. It was called the Grande Armée, a force of more than 600,000 soldiers drawn from across the empire. French, Poles, Italians, Germans, Dutch, and more. It was not just an army. It was a continent marching under Napoleon's banner. Yet within its diversity lay weakness. Many were reluctant allies, fighting not out of loyalty, but because they were compelled. And as they marched toward Russia, this flaw would soon be exposed. In June 1812, Napoleon crossed the Niemen River and began the invasion. His strategy was simple: move fast, crush the Russian army in a decisive battle, and force Alexander to negotiate. But the Russians had learned from Napoleon's earlier campaigns. They refused to fight on his terms. Instead, they retreated deeper into their vast country, burning villages, fields, and supplies as they went. It was a scorched earth strategy, a cruel, deliberate destruction that left nothing for the French army to eat or use. The summer sun scorched the fields, the marches dragged on, and hunger began to gnaw at the once mighty Grande Armée. Still, Napoleon pressed forward, believing that victory was just one great battle away. That battle came in September 1812, at a small village called Borodino, outside Moscow. The Battle of Borodino was unlike anything Europe had ever seen. Over 250,000 men clashed in a single day of horror. Cannons roared, muskets fired, and men fell by the tens of thousands. Napoleon threw his men forward again and again against the Russian defenses. By nightfall, the field was littered with corpses, the air thick with smoke and blood. The French had technically won. The Russians had retreated. But it was a hollow victory. Napoleon had lost 30,000 men in a single day, and the Russian army was not destroyed. For the first time, glory came at too high a cost. A week later, Napoleon entered Moscow, expecting the Tsar to surrender. But the city was silent, almost empty. Then flames erupted across the capital. Moscow was burning, set ablaze by its own people to deny Napoleon shelter and supplies. The emperor, who had conquered half of Europe, now found himself in a ghost city, surrounded by fire and despair. He waited for peace negotiations that never came. Weeks passed, winter approached, and the dream of victory began to crumble. At last, with supplies running out and no sign of surrender, Napoleon gave the order to retreat. What followed was one of the greatest disasters in military history. The French army, already weakened by hunger, now faced a brutal Russian winter. Temperatures plunged below freezing, snowstorms blinded the soldiers, and frostbite claimed lives with merciless speed. Horses collapsed, wagons broke, and entire units vanished in the white void of ice and snow. The retreat turned into a nightmare. Russian forces harassed the retreating columns, striking at the exhausted men. Starvation drove soldiers to eat their own horses, even to leather their belts. Disease spread. The Grande Armée, 600,000 strong, disintegrated into a desperate, broken mob. By the time Napoleon staggered back across the Niemen River, fewer than 100,000 men remained. The empire had bled itself dry in the frozen wastes of Russia. This catastrophe shook Europe to its core. The myth of Napoleon's invincibility was shattered. His enemies, Austria, Prussia, Britain, and Russia, sensed weakness and rallied once more against him. Across the continent, uprisings spread. Spain continued its guerrilla war, bleeding the French army slowly. In Germany, resentment boiled into open resistance. The tide of fortune had turned, and the man who had once dictated the fate of nations now found himself fighting desperately to preserve what remained of his empire. Yet even in defeat, Napoleon's spirit remained unbroken. He returned to Paris ahead of his shattered army, and through sheer willpower raised new forces. But the old magic was fading. The soldiers were younger, less experienced, and the people of France were weary of endless war. His marshals, once loyal and fearless, now doubted his judgment. Europe closed in, determined to end his rule once and for all. The battles that followed, Dresden, Leipzig, the so-called Battle of Nations, showed flashes of Napoleon's brilliance, but also the growing reality of his decline. At Leipzig in 1813, nearly 500,000 soldiers clashed in the largest battle Europe had ever seen. Napoleon fought bravely, but the odds were overwhelming. Surrounded by a coalition of nations, his army was crushed, and his empire began to collapse. By 1814, Allied armies marched into France itself. For the first time, war came to Napoleon's homeland. Cities fell, villages burned, and the French people, exhausted and desperate for peace, could no longer resist. Even then, Napoleon fought with the courage of a cornered lion, winning small battles against overwhelming numbers. But it was too late. Paris surrendered, and the emperor was forced to abdicate. Napoleon Bonaparte, once the master of Europe, was exiled to the small island of Elba from commanding millions. He was reduced to ruling a tiny strip of land in the Mediterranean. To many, it seemed the story was over. The conqueror had been conquered, the emperor reduced to a prisoner. But history was not finished with Napoleon. Even in exile, he dreamed of return, and the world would soon learn that his ambition could not be contained by walls or oceans. The invasion of Russia had broken his empire, but not his spirit. The man who had once risen from obscurity to rule Europe would rise again, if only for one last dramatic act. The glory of Napoleon's reign, built on years of conquest and reform, reached its zenith by 1810. Yet, in the very height of his power lay the seeds of his destruction. He had carved an empire across Europe, placing his relatives on thrones, commanding kings as if they were his lieutenants, and rewriting the political order of the continent. But such dominance could not go unchallenged forever. The alliances he broke, the territories he seized, and the arrogance that came with success began to set Europe against him. The same brilliance that lifted him to the throne would now drive him into the greatest mistakes of his life. And with each miscalculation, the walls of his empire would begin to crumble. The first cracks appeared with his continental system, a grand economic blockade designed to weaken Britain by forbidding trade with the rest of Europe. To Napoleon, it was not enough to dominate the land. He wanted to strangle Britain's economy, the one rival he could never defeat at sea. But enforcing this system across vast territories was nearly impossible. Smuggling thrived, and resentment grew among his allies who suffered more than Britain itself. Countries like Portugal and Spain openly defied him, forcing Napoleon into costly campaigns in the Iberian Peninsula. The so-called Spanish ulcer drained French resources and exposed the vulnerability of his empire. Guerrilla fighters, backed by British forces under the Duke of Wellington, turned the war in Spain into a brutal quagmire. Still, Napoleon's ambition pressed on. His eyes turned eastward, toward Russia, whose Tsar Alexander I grew increasingly restless under the continental system. Their once uneasy alliance shattered, and Napoleon decided on a gamble that would become the most catastrophic decision of his career: the invasion of Russia. In June 1812, he assembled the Grande Armée, the largest force Europe had ever seen. Over 600,000 soldiers drawn from across his empire. It was not just a military campaign. It was a show of dominance, meant to crush resistance and remind Europe of his unmatched power. The march into Russia began with confidence, but Russia was unlike any battlefield Napoleon had faced before. The Russian army avoided direct confrontation, retreating deeper into their vast homeland and burning everything behind them: villages, crops, supplies, all destroyed in a scorched earth policy that left the French advancing but starving. Napoleon's soldiers marched forward, but instead of victory, they found hunger, exhaustion, and endless miles of desolation. Finally, in September 1812, Napoleon reached Moscow, expecting the surrender of the Russian Tsar. Instead, he found the city nearly abandoned and soon engulfed in flames. The Russians had torched their own capital rather than let it fall intact. Napoleon lingered in the ruins, waiting for peace terms that never came. As the harsh Russian winter descended, his army situation grew desperate. Supplies dwindled, frostbite and disease ravaged the ranks, and morale collapsed. When Napoleon finally ordered the retreat, it was too late. The once mighty Grande Armée disintegrated on the frozen roads. Of the 600,000 men who marched in, fewer than 100,000 stumbled back alive. The disaster in Russia shook Europe. It was proof that Napoleon was not invincible. His enemies seized a moment. Prussia, Austria, Britain, and Russia formed a new coalition, determined to end his domination once and for all. Battles raged across Germany, culminating in the massive Battle of Leipzig in 1813, known as the Battle of Nations. Here, Napoleon faced overwhelming odds as armies from multiple countries converged. Despite his tactical brilliance, the sheer numbers against him proved too great. His forces were defeated, and the tide of war turned irreversibly. By 1814, the war reached French soil. For the first time in his career, Napoleon was fighting not as a conqueror, but as a defender of his homeland. His genius still shone in these desperate campaigns. He won several battles, even when outnumbered, moving swiftly across the French countryside in a final display of his tactical brilliance. But the coalition was relentless. Paris fell in March 1814, and with it, the dream of an eternal French empire. Facing pressure from all sides, Napoleon abdicated the throne. The emperor was exiled to the island of Elba, a small rocky outpost off the coast of Italy. From ruling half of Europe, he was now reduced to governing a tiny island. For many, this was the end of Napoleon. Yet even in exile, he remained restless, watching the political instability of France under the restored Bourbon monarchy. To his followers, the dream was not over. To his enemies, the nightmare was not yet finished. In February 1815, Napoleon made his daring escape. With just a small band of supporters, he sailed back to France. The French soldiers sent to arrest him instead rallied to his side. As he marched north toward Paris, his legend reawakened. Crowds cheered, armies defected, and within weeks he had reclaimed power without a single shot fired. This brief return to glory would be remembered as the 100 Days. Europe trembled once again, but the coalition was ready. They would not allow Napoleon to destabilize Europe again. In June 1815, his fate would be decided on the fields of Belgium at the Battle of Waterloo. It was here that Napoleon, for the last time, displayed his strategic brilliance and unyielding spirit. But fate, weather, and the resilience of his enemies combined against him. The British forces under the Duke of Wellington, reinforced by the Prussians under Blücher, broke his army. After a day of fierce fighting, the French were routed. Waterloo was not just a military defeat. It was a final fall of a man who once seemed unstoppable. Napoleon was captured and sent into exile again, this time to the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic, far from the continent he once dominated. Here, under constant British watch, the great emperor would live out the last years of his life, no longer commanding armies, no longer shaping nations, but left with only his memories and the weight of his own legend. Napoleon's downfall was not just a story of military defeat. It was a story of human ambition at its highest and most tragic. The brilliance that lifted him to the heights of power was the same force that led him to gamble too far, to chase glory beyond reason, until the world turned against him. His empire lay in ruins, but his story was far from forgotten. On the lonely island of St. Helena, surrounded by the endless waters of the South Atlantic, Napoleon Bonaparte lived his final years in exile, far from the battlefields, far from the thrones he once dictated to, far from the roar of cannon and the march of soldiers. He was now a prisoner of history. The world had caged the man who once commanded half of Europe. His empire was gone, his army scattered, but his story was far from finished. For even in defeat, Napoleon remained one of the most compelling figures the world had ever known. Day after day, he walked the rocky paths of St. Helena, reflecting on his life, dictating his memoirs, shaping how future generations would remember him. To some, he was a tyrant, a man who bathed Europe in blood for the sake of his own ambition. To others, he was a genius, a leader who had shattered the chains of the old aristocracy and carried the ideals of the French Revolution across Europe. Which version was true? Perhaps both. Napoleon's legacy was a paradox, as grand and complex as the man himself. He was a conqueror, but also a reformer. He crowned himself emperor, yet insisted he ruled in the name of the people. He destroyed nations, but also built institutions that survive to this very day. The Napoleonic Code, his system of laws, remains the foundation of legal systems in countries around the world. It established equality before the law, protection of property rights, and secular authority over the church. In doing so, it became one of the most influential legal frameworks in modern history. He reformed education, administration, and finance. He centralized the French state, making it more efficient and powerful. He modernized armies and revolutionized the art of war, teaching generals for generations how mobility, speed, and decisive strikes could overcome larger forces. His campaigns are still studied in military academies across the globe. In this sense, even in defeat, Napoleon continued to command the world's attention. But his ambition also left scars that cannot be forgotten. His wars killed millions, devastated nations, and turned Europe into a theater of endless bloodshed. He sought to spread revolutionary ideals, But in doing so, he often replaced monarchs with his own family, creating a new dynasty under his name. His desire for power knew no boundaries, and it was his hunger that drove him to Russia, to Spain, to Waterloo, to his ultimate downfall. In Exile, Napoleon understood this duality. He portrayed himself as a martyr, a man betrayed by monarchs and crushed by the fear of his enemies. He cast himself not as a tyrant, but as a torchbearer of progress, the champion of modernity against the reactionary old order. He told his story with skill, crafting a legend that would outlive him. And it worked. Across Europe, across the world, people debated his name, his deeds, his meaning. Was he the destroyer of liberty or its defender? Was he a monster or a hero? In May 1821, at the age of just 51, Napoleon Bonaparte breathed his last on St. Helena. Some say it was stomach cancer. Others whisper of poison. Whatever the cause, his final words echo the essence of his life. France, army, Josephine. Even in death, he belonged to his nation, his soldiers, and the love he had lost long ago. But Napoleon did not disappear with his death. His shadow loomed large over Europe. Monarchs feared his memory as much as they had feared his armies. Yet ordinary people, veterans, and dreamers clung to his legend. In France, the Napoleonic myth grew stronger, inspiring revolutions and leaders for generations. His nephew, Napoleon III, would one day rise to power, claiming the same legacy, the same vision. The very name Bonaparte became a symbol of glory, of ambition, of destiny. Outside France, Napoleon's influence was equally profound. His wars reshaped borders, toppled empires, and set the stage for the rise of nationalism across Europe. Germany and Italy, once divided, began to dream of unification. The balance of power established after his fall would dominate European politics for decades. Even his enemies, Britain among them, were forced to modernize and adapt in response to him. Napoleon had changed the game, and the world could never return to what was before him. His image endured in art, literature, and memory. Painters captured him as a stoic commander on horseback, leading his men through storms of fire. Writers and poets debated his meaning. Was he a hero of the people, or the ultimate cautionary tale of unchecked ambition? Across centuries, his name became legend, as recognizable as Alexander the Great or Julius Caesar. Today, when we speak of Napoleon, we speak of more than a man. We speak of the eternal human struggle between ambition and limitation, between vision and reality. He rose higher than most ever dared, and he fell harder than most could imagine. Yet his life, with all its triumphs and tragedies, continues to inspire fascination. His reforms shaped nations. His battles changed history. His myth became immortal. Napoleon once said, "What is history? But a fable agreed upon." Perhaps no words capture his legacy better. He wrote his own fable, ensuring that history would forever debate him, never forget him. To some, he remains a great emperor, the man of destiny, the bringer of order out of chaos. To others, he remains a tyrant, the man who sacrificed millions for his crown. But in both, he remains unforgettable. And so, on that distant island where the waves crash endlessly against the rocks, the story of Napoleon Bonaparte did not end. It transformed. From man to myth, from emperor to legend, from conqueror to symbol. His empire fell, but his legacy endures, etched into the laws we follow, the nations we inhabit, and the very imagination of humanity. The boy from Corsica who once dreamed of greatness became the man who shook the world. And though his throne is long gone, his name will echo as long as history is told. From soldier to emperor, from genius to exile, Napoleon's story is a reminder that ambition can build empires but also destroy them. His victories rewrote history. His reforms shaped modern law. And his downfall taught the world that no empire lasts forever. The question remains, was Napoleon Bonaparte the greatest leader in history, or the most dangerous dreamer Europe ever knew? The answer lies in the lessons we take from his rise and fall. Backhand index pointing right if you enjoyed this journey into Napoleon's life. Like this video, thumbs up. Share it with fellow history lovers globe showing Europe, Africa. And subscribe to History Vault for more powerful stories of the past. Until next time, Keep exploring history, because the past is never truly gone. It lives with us.